The history books tell you the Sioux and the Cheyenne were enemies turned allies, two separate nations bound only by war and treaty. But new DNA research is quietly suggesting something that could rewrite everything you thought you knew about where these people actually came from. If this story pulls at something in you, if you have ever wondered whether the labels we put on people hide a deeper truth, stay with me until the end, because this one might change how you see identity itself. For generations, we have been told a simple story. The Sioux and the Cheyenne were two proud but very different nations of the Great Plains. Different languages, different origin stories, different homelands before they ever met on the grasslands of what is now the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Montana. We picture them as separate peoples who crossed paths through trade, through conflict, and eventually through alliance against a common enemy. That is the version taught in most classrooms. Two nations, two bloodlines, one shared destiny on the plains. And on the surface, this story makes sense. The Cheyenne spoke a language from the Algonquian family, a language tied to peoples who once lived far to the east, near the Great Lakes. The Sioux, made up of the Lakota, the Dakota, and the Nakota, spoke a Sioux language, a completely different family of words and sounds, different grammar, different ways of naming the world. If language tells the story of a people, then these were two very different rivers of history that just happened to meet. But here is where things start to get strange, because language is not blood. Language can be borrowed, lost, replaced, or reshaped by history. And when scientists began looking past words, past treaties, past the stories written by outsiders, and started looking directly into the ancient genetic code of indigenous peoples across North America, they found patterns that do not match the simple picture of separate rival nations with separate ancient bloodlines. Let us slow down and think about where these two peoples actually came from before they were even called Sioux or Cheyenne. Long before horses ever touched the plains, both of these peoples were forest peoples. The ancestors of the Cheyenne are believed to have lived in the western Great Lakes region, in what is now Minnesota, farming and fishing along lakes and rivers. The ancestors of the Sioux nations also trace their homeland to that same general region, the woodlands and lake country of Minnesota and Wisconsin. Two peoples, different languages, but living close to each other, sharing the same rivers, the same seasons, the same forests, for a very, very long time. That alone should make you pause. Neighbors for centuries, sharing land, likely sharing marriages, likely sharing more of each other's lives than the neat, separate boxes of history usually allow. And then, over time, both of these peoples were pushed west. Pressure from European colonization, pressure from other indigenous nations being displaced, and pressure from the fur trade pushed them out of the woodlands and onto the open plains. It was there, on those endless grasslands with the horse newly arrived on the continent, that both peoples transformed into the powerful mounted nations we picture today. Here is the first thing that should make you curious. If both peoples moved through the same region, lived near the same waters, and were driven west by the same historical pressures, how separate were they, really, deep in their ancestry, before any of that happened? This is where ancient DNA enters the story, and where things get genuinely surprising. If you are the kind of person who likes uncovering the parts of history that never made it into textbooks, drop a single word in the comments right now, just the word ancestors. So I know you are the kind of viewer who wants the real story, not the simplified one. Now let us talk about what ancient DNA actually is, and why it matters so much here. When scientists study ancient DNA, they are not reading some kind of magic code that spells out a person's tribe or nation. What they are doing is far more careful and far more humble than that. They extract tiny fragments of genetic material from ancient bones or teeth, sometimes thousands of years old, and they compare those fragments to the DNA of people living today. This lets researchers trace deep patterns of migration, ancestry, and relatedness across huge stretches of time, sometimes tens of thousands of years. And when it comes to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, this kind of research has revealed something remarkable. Nearly all Native American populations across North and South America can trace their deep ancestry back to a single wave, or a small number of closely related waves of people who crossed from Siberia into the Americas during the last ice age, likely by way of a land bridge that no longer exists. This means that at the deepest level, going back many thousands of years, almost every indigenous nation across two entire continents shares a common root. Now hold that thought, because here is where it gets personal to our story. If the Sioux and the Cheyenne, along with hundreds of other nations, all descend from these same deep ancestral populations, then the idea of them being fundamentally separate peoples starts to look very different. They are not separate trees with separate roots. Some researchers believe they may be more like separate branches that grew apart over thousands of years, shaped by different environments, different neighbors, different languages, but still connected far below the surface, in a shared ancient root system that stretches back to the very first people who ever set foot on this continent. This is not the same as saying the Sioux and Cheyenne are simply the same people. That would be too simple, and it would erase the very real, very meaningful differences that these nations built over centuries, their own languages, their own ceremonies, their own histories of struggle and survival. But it does mean something important. It means the sharp line we draw between them, the idea that they were always two completely distinct bloodlines who happened to collide on the plains, may be far less absolute than we assumed. Here is where the story deepens even further, and where the emotional weight of this really starts to land. Historians who study the Plains nations point out that the Cheyenne and the Sioux did not simply meet as strangers and decide to become allies out of convenience. The evidence suggests something more intimate happened over generations. Intermarriage between the two peoples became common. Families were built across those language lines. Children grew up speaking both tongues, carrying both traditions, belonging fully to both worlds. Alliance was not just political. It became woven into blood, into families, into the literal DNA passed down through generations of children born to Cheyenne mothers and Lakota fathers, or Lakota mothers and Cheyenne fathers. Think about what that means. Every time we say the Sioux and the Cheyenne as if they are two sealed boxes, we may be ignoring the living, breathing reality that for many families on the plains, there was no box at all. There was just family. Grandparents from one nation, grandchildren raised in the traditions of another, and blood that flowed freely between both. So now we have two powerful threads pulling at the simple story we started with. First, the deep ancient DNA that connects nearly all indigenous peoples of the Americas to a shared ancestral origin, stretching back many thousands of years before anyone was called Sioux or Cheyenne. Second, the more recent but still profound mixing of these two specific peoples through generations of intermarriage once they became neighbors on the plains. And this raises the real question that ancient DNA research keeps circling back to. What does it actually mean to belong to a tribe or a nation if the genetic story underneath it all is this connected, this shared, this woven together? If you have ever felt like the labels people use to divide us are simpler than the truth underneath, take a moment right now and imagine sharing this video with someone who has native ancestry, or someone who has always been curious about where their own family really came from. This story might mean more to them than you expect. Let us go even deeper, because there is another layer to this that most people never hear about. Before the Cheyenne and the Sioux became the mounted buffalo hunting nations that history remembers, before they even fully separated from their eastern woodland roots, they were part of a much larger, more fluid world of indigenous nations across North America. Trade routes stretched for thousands of miles. Marriages crossed nations. Captives were sometimes adopted fully into new families and new peoples, becoming, over a generation or two, genuinely part of that nation, not just prisoners, but full members, their children raised as Cheyenne or raised as Lakota, with no asterisk attached to their belonging. This is something that often gets lost when we look at Native history through a purely European lens, where bloodline and nationality are treated as fixed and permanent. Many indigenous nations of North America had a very different, more flexible understanding of belonging. You could become part of a nation through adoption, through marriage, through choosing to live among a people and take up their ways. Nationhood was not always about pure bloodlines. It was often about relationship, responsibility, and shared life. So when ancient DNA studies show close genetic ties or even direct overlaps between people we call Sioux and people we call Cheyenne, this is not some shocking contradiction of their history. In many ways, it actually confirms what their own oral traditions and social practices had already been telling us. These were never fully sealed, separate populations. They were peoples who moved, mixed, adopted, and intermarried constantly, shaping each other's futures long before any scientist ever looked at a single strand of ancient DNA. But here's the twist that makes this story even more complicated and even more human. At the very same time that these two peoples were bound together through marriage, trade, and alliance, they were also, at various points in history, genuine rivals. Territory disputes happened, conflicts happened. This was not some peaceful, unified plains utopia where everyone was one big, happy family all the time. Real tension existed. Real battles were fought, sometimes between these same two peoples who, in other generations, were raising children together and standing side by side against outside threats. This is where the human truth of the story becomes almost impossible to ignore. Family and rivalry were not opposites on the plains. They existed together, tangled up in the same relationships, sometimes in the very same families. A person could have cousins on both sides of a conflict. A leader might have blood relatives among people his own nation was fighting. This is not some clean, simple story of friends or enemies. It is a deeply human story of people who were connected by blood and history, even while their nations sometimes clashed. And does not that sound familiar? Does not that sound like something closer? To real human history everywhere, Messy, intimate, contradictory, full of love and conflict tangled together rather than the neat, separated story we usually get taught? Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. How many other rival groups in history, groups we picture as completely separate and opposed, might actually share the same kind of hidden, tangled ancestry underneath the surface, if only someone took the time to look? Now let us bring in what some of the actual scientific research has cautiously suggested, while being honest about how careful we have to be here. Ancient DNA research into indigenous peoples of the Americas is still a young and rapidly developing field. Many indigenous communities have understandably been cautious and sometimes resistant to this kind of research, given a long, painful history of scientists studying native remains and native bodies without permission, respect, or consent. Because of this, much of the most meaningful ancient DNA work has been done in careful partnership with tribal nations, or has focused on broader population patterns rather than claiming to define any single person's identity through a genetic test. With that important context in mind, with the broader body of ancient DNA research, person's identity through a genetic test. With that important context in mind, what the broader body of ancient DNA research has shown again and again across many different indigenous populations in North America is a story of deep, ancient shared ancestry combined with more recent regional mixing. Populations that lived near each other, traded with each other, and intermarried with each other tend to show closer genetic relationships than populations separated by vast distances or centuries of isolation. Given how closely the ancestors of the Cheyenne and the Sioux lived to each other in the woodlands of the Great Lakes region, and given how extensively they intermarried once they became to each other in the woodlands of the Great Lakes region, and given how extensively they intermarried once they became plains neighbors, researchers studying these population patterns believe it is likely, though not something that can be reduced to a single simple headline, that genetic overlap between these two peoples is significant. Some researchers frame this as evidence that the deep divide we imagine between Sioux and Cheyenne as bloodlines is, in large part, a product of language, culture, and political history, rather than some ancient, unbridgeable genetic separation. This is important because it does not erase the real, distinct cultural identities these two nations built. Language is real. Ceremony is real. Historical experience is real. The Cheyenne have their own sacred stories, their own way of understanding the world, built over centuries, and so do the Lakota, the Dakota, and the Nakota peoples of the Sioux nations. None of that becomes less true or less meaningful because of shared ancient ancestry. If anything, it becomes more remarkable because it shows how two peoples, connected by deep roots, still built beautifully distinct ways of life, distinct languages, distinct identities through the choices, struggles, and stories of countless generations. Maybe that is the real shock hiding inside this story. Not that the Sioux and the Cheyenne are somehow secretly the same people, which would be an oversimplified and honestly disrespectful way to describe two nations with such rich, distinct histories. The real shock is something more profound. It is the idea that identity itself, the very thing we think divides people into separate boxes, is far more fluid, far more woven together than the labels ever let on. If this idea is landing with you, the way it is landing with real shock is something more profound. It is the idea that identity itself, the very thing we think divides people into separate boxes, is far more fluid, far more woven together than the labels ever let on. If this idea is landing with you the way it is landing with me, let me ask you something. Well, what tribe, nation, or culture do you belong to? And have you ever wondered how far back your own story really goes underneath the surface? Type your answer below. I want to know. Let us step back now and look at the bigger picture this reveals about how we tell history in general. For centuries, the story of the Sioux and the Cheyenne was written mostly by outsiders, by European explorers, by American settlers, by government officials drawing lines on maps and lines between tribes for the purpose of treaties, land claims, and control. Tribes for the purpose of treaties, land claims, and control. These outside observers often needed clean, simple categories. This nation here, that nation there. Clear boundaries made it easier to negotiate, easier to divide land, easier to write reports back to distant governments. But real human communities rarely fit into clean boxes. And indigenous nations of the plains, with their fluid systems of marriage, adoption, and alliance, fit these outside boxes especially poorly. The Sioux, as a single unified nation, is itself something of a simplification, since it is really made up of three major groups: the Lakota, the Dakota, boxes especially poorly. The Sioux, as a single unified nation, is itself something of a simplification, since it is really made up of three major groups: the Lakota, the Dakota, and the Nakota, each with their own dialects and traditions, sometimes further divided into many smaller bands and communities. The neat single label Sioux flattens a complex, layered reality into something easier for outsiders to understand and control. The same is true in different ways for the Cheyenne, who themselves were historically divided into different bands, and at times closely intertwined with other peoples, through alliance and shared life on the plains. When you start to see how much simplification was already baked into these labels from the very beginning, the plains. When you start to see how much simplification was already baked into these labels from the very beginning, the ancient DNA findings start to feel less like a shocking contradiction, and more like a long overdue correction. A correction that says the real story was always more complicated, more connected, and more human than the simple boxes historians and government officials found convenient. This is where the story becomes something bigger than just the Sioux and the Cheyenne. It becomes a story about how easily we accept simple narratives about entire peoples, without asking who benefited from that simplicity and what got lost in the process. Because here's shocking contradiction, and more like a long overdue correction. A correction that says the real story was always more complicated, more connected, and more human than the simple boxes historians and government officials found convenient. This is where the story becomes something bigger than just the Sioux and the Cheyenne. It becomes a story about how easily we accept simple narratives about entire peoples, without asking who benefited from that simplicity and what got lost in the process. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Clean, separate categories are often easier for the people writing the history books than for the people actually living the history. Colonizers benefited from being able to say, this land belongs to this nation, and that conflict is between these two separate enemies, because it made land grabs, treaties, and broken promises easier to justify and easier to manage. A more complicated, tangled truth, one where families crossed nation lines, where blood and culture did not always align with neat borders, was far less convenient for the people writing the history books than for the people actually living the history. Colonizers benefited from being able to say this land belongs to this nation, and that conflict is between these two separate enemies, because it made land grabs, treaties, and broken promises easier to justify and easier to manage. A more complicated, tangled truth, one where families crossed nation lines, where blood and culture did not always align with neat borders, was far less convenient for the people drawing up those borders. Ancient DNA research does not care about convenience. It does not care about old treaties or old maps. It simply looks at what is actually written into human bodies, passed down silently across generations, and lets that speak for itself. And what it is saying when it comes to peoples like the Sioux and the Cheyenne is that the human story underneath the surface was always richer, more connected, and more deeply intertwined than the simplified history most of us grew up learning. Let us bring this back to something personal, something that goes beyond simplified history most of us grew up learning. Let us bring this back to something personal, something that goes beyond just these two nations. Think about your own family for a moment. Think about how many different lines of ancestry probably run through your own blood, lines you may not even know about, going back through great-grandparents and beyond, into places and peoples whose names might surprise you if you ever traced them all the way back. Almost every human being alive today carries this same kind of hidden complexity inside them. We just do not usually think about it, because we are taught to think of identity in simple terms. This nationality, that ethnicity, this tribe, that tribe, but never trace them all the way back. Almost every human being alive today carries this same kind of hidden complexity inside them. We just do not usually think about it because we are taught to think of identity in simple terms. This nationality, that ethnicity, this tribe, that tribe. But biology rarely respects the clean lines we draw on maps or in history books. It flows the way rivers flow, following the paths of real human relationships, real marriages, real migrations, mixing and merging in ways that no map or treaty ever fully captures. So when we talk about the Sioux versus the Cheyenne, and when new research keeps gently pulling at the threads of that simple separation, we are not just learning something about two specific nations of the American plains. We are being reminded of something true about all of human history. The lines we draw between us, all of human history, the lines we draw between us and them, between one people and another, are almost always more blurry, more connected, and more human than they first appear. Here is where I want you to sit with a question, because I think it matters more than any single historical fact in this whole story. If ancient DNA and long-forgotten family histories can reveal this kind of hidden connection between two peoples we were taught to think of as simply different, what other divisions in our world today might be built on the exact same kind of oversimplified story? We are almost at the end of this journey. This might be built on the exact same kind of oversimplified story. We are almost at the end of this journey. But before we get there, I want to bring you back to the plains themselves, because that is where this story truly lives. Picture a Cheyenne mother and a Lakota father raising children together on the open grasslands, generations before anyone in a laboratory would ever study a single strand of their descendants' DNA. Picture their children growing up speaking both languages, carrying both sets of stories, feeling at home in both worlds. Picture cousins who might one day stand on opposite sides of a conflict and yet still carry the same blood, the same grandparents, the same deep root. A system reaching back thousands of years to the first people who ever crossed into this continent. This is not a clean story. It is not a simple story. But it is, I think, a truer story than the one most of us were taught. And there is something deeply moving about that, because it means that even in moments of conflict, even in moments where history remembers these two nations as rivals, or later as allies against a common threat, there was always this deeper truth underneath. They were never as separate as the map suggested. They were always, in some very real sense, family. Ancient DNA cannot tell us everything. It cannot capture the full weight of culture, language, ceremony, and lived experience that make the Cheyenne, and the Lakota, and the Dakota, and Nakota who they are. Historians still debate exactly how much genetic overlap exists, and how it should be interpreted with the care and respect these living nations deserve. But what this research does offer is a powerful invitation. An invitation to look past the simple labels we inherited and to see the deeper, more tangled, more human truth that was always there, quietly written into the blood of the people who called these plains home. So maybe the real shock in this story is not a single dramatic discovery buried in a lab somewhere. Maybe the real shock is much simpler and much harder to shake once you see it. The lines history draws between peoples are rarely as solid as they look. Underneath every rivalry, every treaty, every border on an old map, there are usually families, real families, crossing those lines quietly, generation after generation, whether anyone was watching or not. And if that is true for the Sioux and the Cheyenne, two nations we have spent centuries treating as separate chapters in the same story, then maybe it is worth asking what other stories, what other rivalries, what other divisions we take for granted might be hiding the exact same truth, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough to see it. If this story changed even a small piece of how you think about identity, history, or where we all really come from, that is exactly why stories like this deserve to be told. Because sometimes the deepest truths about who we are have been sitting quietly in the blood all along, waiting patiently for someone to finally ask the right question.